I want to talk about communication accommodation theory right now, and I'm going to talk about it in a way that's somewhat similar to, but a little bit different from the book. It's also a theory that I know quite a bit about because early on in my career, much of my research focused on communication accommodation theory. Um, it has several basic propositions that are its key components. And I think the way of overview this is to think about the fact that oftentimes when people get together, they often become more similar in the way they're communicating with one another. So, for example, if one person's nonverbal expressions tend to be more positive and smiling, that tends to elicit similar kinds of responses from another person. If one talks a little more slowly or quietly, then the other person they're talking to may also, in turn, talk a little more slowly and quietly. Have you ever wondered why you pick up an accent? You pick up an accent when you move to another area of the country because you end up spending time and even if it's somewhat subconsciously, learning to speak and pronunciate words in the way that they do. It's a very natural tendency for humans, particularly when they're having a conversation, to kind of become more similar in their communication styles. It's a way of developing the sense of shared identity. It's a way of thinking about how we're cooperating with one another in order to develop one conversation. So when we're dealing with people who are peers, like who there's no status or role differences, then if we start talking, we oftentimes become a little bit more similar on a number of communication dimensions. That's what's referred to as convergence. Now, when there are differences, like when you're talking to me or you're in an employment interview, our roles are different, our power is different, and so we maintain different communication styles consistent with those role or power differences. The other times we sometimes communicate differently from one another is if I don't like you or you don't like me, then if I communicate one way, like say approach you and I'm smiling and I want to be engaged talking with you, you may show your avoidance by diverging, by perhaps turning your body away, not smiling, and not being very responsive to the things that we talk about. So that's kind of the overall orientation about how you think about a communication accommodation. We become more similar to people when we're having conversations in order to have a more productive one. If we don't like people, we diverge from one another often, or one person diverges from another to show some sort of distance or dislike. And then when there are role or power differences, we maintain different communication styles. So, with that kind of as a general overview, let's talk about specific components. So, one proposition is people will converge toward the communication features of their partner if they wish to win approval or socially identify with someone. I think you could also say it's just a function of when we're in a cooperative mode, we try to get in sync and use the same communication styles together. Now, as I said, this assumes no role or power differences exist that would prescribe specific communication behaviors. Like if we're in an interview, I'm going to be asking a lot of questions. You're going to probably be doing most of the talking, at least in certain segments of it. We're going to be communicating with differently than one another. We may switch that during an interview, and I may ask if you have some questions, then you ask some questions, and then maybe I do most of the talking. And that's where we, because of our role differences as interviewer and interviewee. Lower status people usually converge more to their higher status or respected partner. And this is when we look at this in terms of if we are where I've seen this has been in intercultural settings where I went to high school. We had 50% of our class was Hispanic and bilingual, spoke Spanish. The other half were Anglo. And yet, when the teachers were in school and when you were visiting with people from the Hispanic community, were visiting with other Anglos, then they would oftentimes be expected to communicate in English to their teachers and to the Anglo students, even though some of the Anglo students were also bilingual. But in that particular case, in that community, the power difference resided more in the Anglo kids than it did in the Hispanic kids. And if people are same status, and maybe they'll work together to converge, like between you and a person you just met, and y'all are similarly college students or something like that. All right, convergence will be, it's usually perceived favorably, but it'll be, and that especially when there's no role or power differences. A lot of teachers don't want to be called by their first name. A lot of professors don't. They want to maintain that difference, and they want you to use an honorific like doctor or professor or something like that. If you were trying to converge to them by using their first name just like you use their first name, then that might not go over too well in the eyes of the higher status person. So there's no role or power differences that prescribe role-specific behaviors. Um, the person, you will not converge, or it will not be liked favorably if the person who's trying to be like you is somebody you don't like. You or somebody who's not like you. So you think that that might be presumptuous, or that you don't have much affinity for that person as they're trying to communicate like. People will diverge from the communication features of their partner if they wish to show approval or socially distance themselves, right? Remember when we talked about uncertainty, when we talked about expectancy violation theory? You know, if I break the kind of norm, but you kind of like me or you like the person that's breaking it, you may reciprocate as well, and as well as have some approach or get closer. Just like, however, if I break the some space violation or some other normative violation, you will then back off and diverge from that to create even more distance from me, perhaps because you don't like me or you think that that's inappropriate. Um, Divergence is usually going to be perceived negatively by the person who's being diverged from. That is, if you back away from your friend or someone who's introducing you, they may think that you're acting kind of aloof or rude or something like that. So it's oftentimes perceived unfavorably in a peer setting. However, it could be perceived somewhat favorably if it's dealing with kind of group differences, like cultural group differences. If you were to, an example that I'm thinking about here is if you were to see a student who's trying to dress like in a suit or with a tie, look very professional in their dress so that they might look a little bit more like a faculty member. Sometimes we see people like that. We think it's a little bit odd. And we think that the way that they're interacting with them, there must be something going on. They're not really trying to be professional, one would presume, but they must have something going on there, like they have a job fair or they've got a special presentation or something like that. Um, so if I'm a member of a lower status group, like if I'm a member of a let's say of a particular motorcycle group, and we have our certain dress and attire that we have. When one of our members chooses not to dress like someone who is like who dresses differently, who's someone that's not a motorcycle member of that group, then we approve of them not dressing like that person because the way they're dressing identifies that they're part of us and part of our group that we hang out with together and the things that we do together. I'll show an example of this later when we talk about intergroup communication. And people will maintain a particular communication style if there are role or normative or power differences prescribing certain communication behaviors. And so that would be things like, as I mentioned, interviewer, interviewee, doctor, patient, teacher, student. In other words, there are certain roles that we have to perform in order to accomplish that interaction. One person has to do the job of an interviewer, the other one has to do the job of an interviewee. Sometimes then when there's power differences to show respect, the person in the lower status position may be more deferential, being polite, saying, thank you and please and I appreciate that, where the person in the more powerful position may be more kind of, not, I don't mean necessarily dominating, but maybe more directive in their communication and telling the person what to do. And the person that's being told what to do will then acquiesce and accept what their particular assignment was, if that was what the nature of the interaction was. And the other time that we may maintain our communication style is if we do not have the linguistic resources to converge to the communication of our partner. Like when we talk with two people from different languages and that each of them don't know the other's language. You've been in situations like that. It's real hard to have that kind of conversation. And notice how we oftentimes rely heavily on nonverbal behaviors and pointing and gesturing and things like that in order to try to help ourselves be understood. And And then we sometimes maintain a particular communication style if we want to maintain a certain identity. This would be consistent when we talked about the expressive message design logics, where I'm going to communicate the way I am because that's who I am and I want to maintain that particular identity that I am. It's also consistent with what we talked about earlier in the semester with regard to negative face.